We focus on what comes next for climate change. Things are getting much worse. We're entering a new climate reality. We're going over 1.5 degrees. Major risks are proliferating. It doesn't mean the game is up. It just means the context for our climate action is that much more challenged.
So I like what happened today at the National Emergency Briefing because they played both bad and good cop in a sense. So it was terrifying on one level. I think people need to be reminded of what is at risk, right? But also at the same time, there's still opportunities for action and we would all benefit from this. What was your take on it?
I think it was good that we used the word emergency. So far, at least for countries like the UK, climate change has not felt like an emergency like COVID felt like, or the financial crisis. But that's about to change because the impacts of climate change are getting worse, they're hitting harder than we thought, and they're going to start to destabilise British society over the coming years and decades. It will then very much feel like an emergency, and we need to do much, much more to be prepared for those times.
How can your work that you do contribute to resolving this crisis?
So we spend a lot of time supporting key organisations to better assess the risks. And at the moment, they're not doing that very well, like a ship in a storm without a radar. An example of this is that pension funds in the UK, many people have, of course, a pension, their pension fund thinks that as we head forward, in the worst case scenario of climate change, about 4 degrees, that will largely have no impact on their pension at all. That's a very poor radar for the storm that we're now in. So we help those organisations to improve their risk assessments, partly so they do more now to try and stop some of these things from happening, but also so that they can weather it when some of the things inevitably do happen to them.
How can that be though? Because the pension funds and the insurance industry as a whole has had all this information for a long time. And there have been some pension funds that have stepped forward, you know, not just in the UK, but also in the US, California, other places like that. How can they have gone backwards rather than embracing a kind of different future? What happened in the last 10 years?
There are some leaders, but the majority of them are still using risk assessments that tell them that climate change isn't really that bad. And that's because those risk assessments use a bunch of academic economics that basically completely underassesses what the impacts could be. That academic economics was developed without the input of scientists, and economists largely guessed what the impacts of climate change would be. Those impacts are proven in real life and our actual experience to be way, way worse than those economists had thought up when they developed their tools in the 80s and 90s. So key institutions are running around, governments, pension funds, others, essentially thinking that the vast hurricane-type gale that's now upon us for climate change is just a minor squall, really. And that's unacceptable and needs to change.
Should the National Emergency Briefing not be a one-off? I mean, I like the idea that they're calling upon the national broadcasters in Britain to have a proper debate about this issue of climate change and what it means for the UK in terms of both the people but also policies and also our relationship with the rest of the world. That's important, but should other countries be also now thinking about going through this kind of process?
Absolutely. So we became used to emergency briefings during COVID, and that was an emergency situation, and this is also one. It might feel different or look different to the type of the COVID emergency, but it is an emergency nonetheless. And we are now at the point where climate change is so severe, the risks are now so great, that we do actually need to have major institutions, politicians, our leaders being honest to us on television, on the other information sources that we have, so that they've really leveled with us about the very dangerous situation we're in and all of the collective effort we're now going to have to put together to navigate that situation.
And I think we've got another message as well, which is that risk, it's moved from risk to certainty in many areas too.
Yeah, absolutely. Day-to-day people do not really appreciate actually the scale of the threat and some of the things that are now possible and might probably happen. So entire parts of the climate system could start to break down. These are what scientists call tipping points. And there's one that faces a country like the UK, which has so far probably felt like it's quite insulated from the impacts of climate change. And if this one tipping point in the Atlantic were to be triggered, which we now cannot rule out, it would have massively destructive impacts on our food system here in the UK. People deserve to know that beyond just the scientific community in the way that they probably deserve to know the threat that was facing the UK from the COVID-19 pandemic when it came upon us. And they did. And we had emergency briefings that told us that climate change has now reached the level where we need those briefings for it as well.
I think just picking on that one point that you made about the UK, I think the scientists told us here today that if that Atlantic conveyor, as it were, of heat switches, we could be seeing from the top of Scotland down to the Wash, so almost like 2/3 of Britain, could for many months of the year be under massively sub-zero temperatures.
Absolutely. So this is the collapse of, as you say, of the major Atlantic circulation. It's one of the reasons why the UK has vineyards at roughly the same latitude that Canada has polar bears. That conveyor belt could ultimately stop moving, and the UK will not have the climate that has enabled our society to flourish. This is an example of where the way we talk about climate change doesn't focus on the worst cases. For any other threat to this country, a war, terrorism, pandemics, we always say, well, what is the worst that could happen? With climate change in the UK, we don't talk about that enough. And the worst that could happen is the Atlantic conveyor could break down, and it could ultimately completely change this country for the worse.
And we need to fight disinformation. I think the fossil fuel industry has really pumped its game up on disinformation recently, possibly because even they're now getting nervous, which is good news, because of the penetration of renewable energy starting to be as cheap as chips and 3 times cheaper than any fossil fuel. So we need to defend the peer-reviewed science. We have a campaign called Make Science Great Again, designed to be cheeky, deliberately, and you're going to get a hat, which is where, okay, I'm moving over here, we got them in the, now you can have the...
I'm going to have to go for a red one.
COP30, yeah, because the red one...
the associations of other red hats.
Yes, and there are certain politicians that don't own the colour red. We need to take the colour red back again. And so we have done Make Science Great Again, and that looks very good. You have to explain to the public, and might be a bit shocked when you see them, that this is about science. Some people don't own the science, right? Some populist politicians are trying to ruin the science, and they're also trying to steal the colour red.
Right. So a crucial thing we've got to bear in mind is that we don't just need to make science great again now, but we need it for what comes next in the future. Because if we don't have the data, the analysis to help us understand what's happening with climate change, the worse it gets, the more confused we could become. And we've had a warning from that future very recently. In Valencia, about a year ago, there were major floods, almost unprecedented in their severity, and a lot of people died. After that climate-driven event, the prospects of the climate-denying party in Spain were boosted, partly because of the fear and confusion of anger that came in the wake of that event. If that dynamic continues, we could be derailed from being able to avoid the very worst case, where climate consequences get in the way of climate action. Crucial to avoiding that will be having science being much greater than even it is and has been in the past, so we can better make sense of a climate change world. If we don't, we will be confused, we'll be polarized, we'll be fragmented.
One point I must ask on that, there is also an element of incompetence from the government in terms of resilience building. So that played into the hands of the populace who said, hey, there's no climate change, and the government's also shit too.
100%. So governments have got to realize that we are now in a new reality. Climate change is not this slow-moving thing that will evolve smoothly and we can make promises now that as a politician we wouldn't have to follow through on in the future because it's way beyond our term. Climate change is here, it is now, and is increasingly creating emergency situations like happened in Valencia last year, like has happened all the way through this year of 2025 and are to come. That requires a different type of leadership. It requires a leadership that's much more like the conditions we saw in the pandemic or in wartime. Leadership that's much more about, in the first instance, protecting communities, and then also as a society, protecting our agency to act. In war and in pandemics, there's always the fear that our agency could become overwhelmed by the scale of those emergencies. The same could be the case with climate change, and politicians have got to understand that we're in a very new context now.
Good. Thank you very much for your time.